She had crossed 3 states, buried her last coin at a depot in Kansas, and arrived in Red Hollow, wearing a dress held together by sheer stubbornness, only to have the man she was supposed to marry look her up and down in front of the entire town and say, "I can't be seen with something like that." One sentence, one moment, and just like that, every promise he'd made across 7 months of letters turned to ash in her hands. If you've ever been judged before, you were even given a chance to speak, stay with me. This one's for you. Hit the like button, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels, and don't go anywhere, because Clara Whitmore is just getting started. The train arrived 40 minutes late, which Clara had already decided to take as a bad sign. She wasn't a superstitious woman by nature, but she'd spent the last 4 days pressed against a window in a car that smelled of coal smoke and other people's livestock, watching the land outside flatten itself into something vast and indifferent. And by the time the whistle shrieked and Red Hollow's platform stuttered into view through the dirty glass, she had very nearly convinced herself to stay on until the next stop. Wherever that was, didn't matter. But she stood up. She always stood up. That was both her best quality and her worst one. The suitcase was brown leather once, probably, in some previous life. Now it was the color of something that had been rained on too many times and never properly dried, and one of the clasps had broken somewhere in Missouri, so she'd wound a length of cord around the whole thing to keep it from falling open in the aisle. She lifted it with both hands, pressed it against her body, and worked her way toward the door. The platform of Red Hollow, Wyoming territory held perhaps 30 people on a good day. This was a good day, apparently, or at least a busy one. There was a general goods wagon being unloaded at the far end, 2 men arguing over a crate with the particular intensity of men who'd been arguing over crates for years, a woman herding 3 small children away from the tracks, and a cluster of townspeople who had simply come to watch the train arrive. The way people in small settlements sometimes did when there wasn't enough else to occupy them. Clara saw all of this in the first few seconds. What she saw in the second few seconds was the man standing apart from the crowd near the platform's edge, wearing a gray suit that was too fine for 11 in the morning on a Tuesday, holding his hat in both hands with the careful deliberateness of someone who wanted you to notice he was holding his hat. He was tall, and he was well-fed, and his mustache was trimmed with a precision that suggested he had opinions about most things. That would be Warren Alcott. She recognized him from the photograph he'd sent in October, the one she'd kept between the pages of a cookbook because she didn't have anywhere else to put it that felt sufficiently private. In the photograph, he'd looked solid, dependable, the kind of man who paid his debts and showed up when he said he would. She had spent 7 months building a version of him in her mind out of his letters, and she was aware, stepping off that train, that the real man would probably not match the constructed one. That was fine. She hadn't expected perfect. She had expected honest. She crossed the platform toward him. She was 26 years old, and she had been walking toward things that frightened her since she was 9, so her stride was steady even if nothing else about her was. The dress was her second best, which meant it had only one visible repair, a seam at the left shoulder where she'd caught it on a fence in Nebraska while helping unload the train to pay for her passage. The boots were a problem she was less able to disguise. The left one had a split along the sole that let in water, and she'd walked through a puddle at the depot in Cheyenne. And while it had dried mostly since then, the leather had warped and the boot sat wrong on her foot, and there was nothing she could do about the way she moved because of it. She walked toward Warren Alcott anyway. He watched her come. She could see him watching, could see the exact moment when his expression, which had started as something approximating anticipation, began to reorganize itself into something else. It happened the way weather changes sometimes. Not gradually, but in a single decisive shift, sky going from one thing to another between one breath and the next. She stopped in front of him. "Mr. Alcott?" He didn't respond immediately. His eyes moved over her. The dress, the suitcase with its cord binding, the boot, back up to her face, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man appraising livestock at a fair. It lasted long enough that the 2 men who'd been arguing over the crate had stopped arguing and were watching instead. Long enough that the woman with the 3 children had paused and turned. Long enough that Clara felt the specific and humiliating heat of being studied in public by someone who had already reached a conclusion. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was even, almost pleasant, the worst kind of voice for what came next. "I have to be honest with you." "All right," she said. I made certain assumptions writing to you about, he paused, turned the hat in his hands, about what I was getting. The word getting landed somewhere between her ribs and stayed there. I see, she said. I have a position in this town, a reputation. The bank, the community. People look to me. He glanced briefly at the watching faces around them, and she understood then, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that he had chosen this moment and this location deliberately, that the audience was not incidental. I can't be seen with something like that. Something? He said it without any particular cruelty, which was almost worse than if he'd shouted it. Just a simple categorization, a thing assessed and found to be of insufficient quality. He put his hat back on, adjusted the brim, and nodded to her with the mechanical courtesy of a man who has concluded a piece of business he found distasteful. I'll arrange for your ticket back to wherever it is you came from. Leave the particulars with the station master. He turned and walked away through the crowd, which parted for him and then closed back around where he'd been standing as though he'd never occupied the space at all. Clara stood on the platform of Red Hollow, Wyoming territory, holding her broken suitcase in both hands, and did not move for approximately 30 seconds. The crowd watched her with the particular fascination people reserve for disasters that are not their own. She could feel it, the weight of 40 eyes deciding what she was based on what had just happened to her. Some of them would feel sorry for her. Some of them were already working out the story they'd tell at dinner. A few of them, the ones with the most imagination, were already deciding what kind of woman gets herself rejected in public by a man of Warren Alcott's standing. They were reaching conclusions about her character the way he'd reached conclusions about her appearance, quickly and without asking. She turned around and walked back to the only bench on the platform and sat down. She was not going to cry. Not here. Not with 30 people watching and deciding who she was based on the quality of her boot leather. The station master was a man named Horace Gill, who was short and had the permanently flustered expression of someone who believed everything was about to go slightly wrong. He appeared at her elbow within a few minutes, holding a clipboard and looking deeply uncomfortable about what he was about to say. Ma'am, he cleared his throat. Mr. Alcott said to let you know the return passage. I'm not taking a return passage, Clara said. He blinked. Ma'am, I arrived here. I'm staying here. She looked up at him. Is there something illegal about that? No, ma'am. Not illegal, no. He cleared his throat again. It's only that, well, Red Hollow's not a large settlement. There's not a great deal in the way of... Is there a boarding house? He hesitated. There's Mrs. Finch's on Alderman Street. But I should tell you, Mrs. Finch is particular about who she... Thank you. Clara stood, picked up her suitcase, and walked in the direction he'd gestured before he'd finished his sentence. She found Mrs. Finch's boarding house without difficulty. Red Hollow was not a town in which anything was difficult to find, being essentially two streets that crossed each other and then gave up. And she stood at the door and knocked with the full awareness that Horace Gill's warning about the woman being particular was a smaller, politer version of a larger truth. The woman who answered was in her 60s maybe, with silver hair pulled into a bun so tight it appeared to be causing her physical pain, and the expression of someone who had long ago decided that her standards were high, and she was proud of that fact and was not going to apologize for it. She looked at Clara. Clara looked at her. I need a room, Clara said. I can pay for 1 week in advance. After that, I'll need to find work, and I'd ask you to extend credit until I'm employed. What kind of work? Mrs. Finch said. Whatever's available. The woman's eyes traveled over her with an efficiency that made Warren Alcott's appraisal feel almost gentle. I heard what happened at the station. I assumed you had, Clara said. I'd guess everyone in town has by now. You're the Alcott woman. I'm Clara Whitmore. I have nothing to do with Warren Alcott. She kept her voice level. Do you have a room or not? Something shifted in Mrs. Finch's face. Not warmth, exactly, but a recalibration. She stepped back from the door. 1 week, coin in advance. The room is small, and I don't allow guests after 8 in the evening. That won't be a problem, Clara said, and stepped inside. Yes, the room was, as promised, small. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand with a cracked basin, a single window that overlooked the alley beside the building, and a hook on the wall for clothes. The floorboards had a soft spot near the door that creaked when you stepped on it, and the window didn't close all the way on the right side, so there was a thin draft that smelled of horse and dust. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, set the suitcase on the floor, and finally let herself think about what had happened. She had $4.30. She had the contents of one worn suitcase, which included 2 dresses, a change of underthings, a pair of wool stockings with a darned heel, a small knife she'd carried since leaving home, because a woman traveling alone needed a small knife, half a bar of soap, and a cookbook her mother had given her that she kept not because she needed the recipes, but because her mother's handwriting was in the margins. She had no job, no connections in this town, and a public reputation that had been established in the space of about 90 seconds by a man in a well-trimmed suit. She sat with all of that for a while, not pretending it was fine and not collapsing under it, just sitting with it, the way you do when things are exactly as bad as they are, and you're not ready to figure out what to do yet, but you're not ready to give up either. Then she unpacked her suitcase, hung her other dress on the hook, set the cookbook on the washstand, and went downstairs to ask Mrs. Finch if she could use the kitchen to heat water. The next morning, she dressed carefully, put on the better of her 2 boots on the wrong foot because it was still less warped than the left one, and went out to find work. Red Hollow had a mercantile, a livery stable, a barber shop, a land office, Warren Alcott's bank, a saloon, and a small building that functioned as both a doctor's office and a dentist's, depending on which day you arrived and what the problem was. There were also approximately a dozen residential buildings, a schoolhouse that appeared to be used for town meetings as well, and 3 structures on the edge of town she couldn't immediately identify. She started with the mercantile. The man behind the counter was named Pruitt, and he had the kind of face that had probably been agreeable once and had hardened into something less so over years of doing business with people he didn't entirely trust. He listened to her ask for work with the patient expression of a man who had already made his decision and was simply waiting for her to finish talking. "I know who you are," he said, when she had. "I assumed. Warren Alcott does business here, has for 12 years. Pruitt picked up a ledger and opened it. "I'm not looking to complicate that." "I see." She waited a moment. "Is there anyone else in town who might need—" "Miss Whitmore." He said her name with a particular finality. "You might want to consider whether Red Hollow is the right place for you." She thanked him and left. The barber shop was similar. The land office didn't need anyone. The saloon's proprietor, a woman named Dora Mackle, who wore her gray hair loose and had a scar through her left eyebrow, and who looked at Clara with something that was not quite hostility and not quite sympathy, but something that sat between them, said she might have something in a week or 2, but she couldn't promise, and when Clara pressed for a clearer answer, she said, "Listen, he's got influence is all. I'll see what I can do," in a way that didn't encourage optimism. By early afternoon, Clara had covered every place of business in Red Hollow and been politely refused by all of them. She stood on the main street in the cooling air of an October afternoon and considered her situation with the particular clear-headedness that comes from having no good options. She had enough money for 6 days at Mrs. Finch's. After that, she would have nothing. Warren Alcott had effectively closed this town to her in the time it had taken him to say 1 sentence on a train platform, and she was just beginning to understand the full dimensions of what he'd done. She was thinking through whether Cheyenne was far enough away to start over when she heard the argument. What? It was coming from the alley beside the mercantile. A man's voice, raised to the level where it stopped being conversation and became something more like a warning, and a second voice that wasn't raised at all, which made it somehow more concerning. Clara slowed. People were occasionally best left to their own disputes, but something in the quality of the second voice, its deliberate quiet, the way it didn't escalate, made her stop and look. 2 men. One was Pruitt, who had apparently followed her out or come out for another reason entirely and been intercepted. The other was someone she didn't recognize. Taller than Pruitt, broader, wearing work clothes that were dirty from actual work rather than performance, with dust on his boots that was several days old and the kind of tan on his hands and forearms that only comes from years of outdoor labor rather than weeks of it. He was holding a folded paper of some kind. "I told you I need the order," the taller man was saying. "And I told you, Hale, credit arrangement ends when I say it ends." Pruitt was 2 feet shorter and aware of it and compensating by being louder. "You're 3 months behind. 3 months. I've been patient. You've been paid every month I said I'd pay. Same arrangement as last year. Last year you didn't have... Pruitt stopped, glanced toward the street, saw Clara standing there, and lowered his voice to something less audible. The man named Hale turned. He had a face that was forgettable in the best possible way. Not ugly, not striking, just a set of regular features that had been weathered into something honest and tired. He was maybe 35, maybe a little older. His eyes were gray and direct in the manner of someone who had spent years looking at long distances and had brought that habit inside. He looked at her without particular interest and then looked back at Pruitt. "You'll have the rest of the balance by the end of November," he said. "Same as we agreed." "The agreement changed." Pruitt folded his arms. "That's what I'm telling you." "Since when?" A pause. Pruitt's expression shifted into something she recognized. The particular discomfort of a man who doesn't want to say the true reason for a decision out loud. "Business circumstances." "Right," the man said. He tucked the paper into his coat pocket, turned, and walked past Clara without looking at her, heading toward the end of the street where a brown horse was tied to the post outside the land office. She watched him for a moment, then turned back to find Pruitt watching her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. He went back inside without speaking. She didn't think about the man called Hale again until 2 days later. By then she had been refused work at every establishment in Red Hollow. Mrs. Finch had received a visit from a woman named Calloway, who was apparently Warren Alcott's widowed sister, and who had said things that Clara didn't hear directly but understood from the way Mrs. Finch's face looked afterward, and the $4.30 had become $3.15 because she had needed to eat. She was sitting at the table in the boarding house's small common room, which was where the boarders were allowed to be during daylight hours, working her way through the arithmetic of exactly how many days she had left before she would be forced to leave, when Mrs. Finch appeared in the doorway. "There's someone here," Mrs. Finch said, with the expression of a woman who had not invited this and wanted that noted. Clara looked up. The man from the alley was standing just inside the front door, hat in his hands, wearing cleaner clothes than before, but not by much. He looked at her with the same gray directness he'd had before. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Yes." She waited. He turned his hat once. "I heard you were looking for work." "That's correct. I have a ranch 6 miles north of town. I need someone who can cook and help with basic maintenance of the house. I can't pay much, I'm honest about that, but it's room and board plus a small wage, and the work is real work." He turned his hat again, the same rotation, like a habit he wasn't aware of. "My name's Gideon Hale." Clara looked at him for a moment. "What happened to your previous help?" "My wife died 8 months ago. She did all of that herself mostly. I've been managing without, but it's not..." He stopped, reconsidered. "It's not practical." "I'm sorry for your loss," she said. "Thank you." He didn't elaborate on it, didn't perform grief or brush it aside, just accepted the condolence and moved forward. She appreciated that. "I should tell you," she said, "that whatever you've heard about the situation at the train station is probably accurate. I didn't hear much. Pruitt mentioned your name, and someone at the livery said you'd been trying to find work." He met her eyes steadily. "I don't have a position on the rest of it. Warren Alcott is a man with influence in this town. Taking me on might create difficulty for you." "He's already created difficulty for me," Hale said. "Has nothing to do with you." She studied him for a moment longer. He didn't look away, didn't fidget, didn't do any of the things men sometimes do when they want something from a woman who is in a poor position to refuse. He just waited with the patience of someone used to waiting on weather. "What would the wages be?" she asked. He named a figure. It was small. He hadn't lied about that, but it was something, and the room and board on top of it meant the arithmetic changed considerably. "All right," she said. "When do you need me?" "Tomorrow morning, if that suits." She nodded. "It suits." He put his hat back on, nodded once, and left. Mrs. Finch appeared in the doorway the moment the front door closed. "Gideon Hale," Mrs. Finch said, in the tone of someone offering relevant information. "He keeps to himself. Ranch hasn't been doing well since he lost Ellen. People in town have opinions about it." "What kind of opinions?" "The kind that aren't any of your business or mine," Mrs. Finch said, which was a more diplomatic answer than Clara had expected from her, and sat down to continue the mending she'd been doing when the visitor arrived. The morning she left for the Hale Ranch, Warren Alcott was standing in front of his bank. She saw him when she came around the corner from Alderman Street, suitcase in hand, heading for the road north. He saw her at the same moment. He was with two other men in similar suits. Business acquaintances, probably, or the kind of men who wanted to be seen in proximity to a banker on a Tuesday morning. She didn't slow down, didn't look away. She walked past him on the other side of the street at the same pace she'd maintained since leaving Mrs. Finch's, looking straight ahead, because she'd spent her first 9 years of life being looked through by people who had decided she was beneath their notice, and she had learned that the only thing worse than being dismissed was letting them see that it still cost her something. She heard him say something to the men with him, low enough that she couldn't make it out. One of them laughed. She kept walking. 6 miles is not an impossible distance, and the morning was cold but clear, and the road north wound through land that was, despite everything, genuinely beautiful. The kind of flat-bottomed valley with ridgelines visible in 3 directions that makes a person feel small in a way that is oddly consoling rather than frightening. She saw a hawk standing on a fence post so motionlessly that she was almost past it before she realized it was alive. She passed a creek that was running low, its banks chalky white with deposits from the summer's dry spell. She passed a cottonwood grove that had gone golden, the leaves moving in a wind she couldn't quite feel down on the road. By the time the Hale Ranch came into view, her left boot had soaked through at the seam again, and her arm ached from carrying the suitcase. But she had stopped counting those things against herself sometime around the 2nd mile. The ranch was not impressive. That was the honest assessment. The house was a low, solid structure that had clearly been built for function rather than aesthetics, with a covered porch along the front that sagged slightly on the left side, and a window in the upper half of the front wall that had a crack in it plugged with what appeared to be a rag. The barn was larger than the house and in marginally better repair, and there were several outbuildings in various states of maintenance. A few horses moved in the corral behind the barn, and there were cattle visible in the pasture beyond, small, dark shapes against the pale grass. Gideon Hale was on the porch when she arrived, repairing something with a length of wire. He looked up, stood. "You made it," he said. "I did." She set the suitcase down and flexed her aching fingers. "It's a nice walk." He looked at her hand, then at the suitcase, and then back up. He was too careful to say anything obvious about it. "I'll show you the house." The house was inside roughly what the outside had suggested, clean or clean enough. He was clearly not a man who lived in squalor, but he was also clearly a man who had been managing a household alone for 8 months while also trying to run a cattle ranch, which meant that some things had simply not been attended to. There was a film of dust on the top of the furniture. The kitchen needed a proper going over. The wood stove needed attention before winter, which by the look of the sky was going to arrive sooner than anyone wanted. But it was solid. The roof held, the floors were sound, the stove would work once it was cleaned, and the small room at the back of the house that was to be hers had a door that closed and latched from the inside, which she had learned over years of moving through the world was not something to take for granted. "It's not what you were expecting," he said, standing in the doorway while she looked around the kitchen. "What do you think I was expecting?" He considered. "Something better than this. Most people would." "I was expecting what I could actually use," she said. "This is what I can actually use." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll leave you to settle in. Noon dinner, if that's—" "I'll have something ready," she said. "What do you have in the larder?" He told her. She assessed. She said she'd manage, and he went back outside with the manner of a man who had said what needed saying and had no interest in saying more. And she found an apron hanging on a hook by the door and put it on and looked at the kitchen around her. It was going to need real work. Not just today, over days. But there was a structure here, underneath the neglect, that someone had built carefully. The shelving was solid. The stove was a good one beneath the buildup. The window above the wash basin faced east, which meant morning light, which meant she'd be able to see what she was doing at the start of each day without fighting the dark. She started a fire in the stove, found the flour, the salt, the small amount of lard, took stock of what was there, made biscuits, because biscuits were fast and filling, and she could manage them with what was on hand, and put a pot of beans on that would be ready by evening, if not by noon. When she heard Gideon come in at midday, she had the biscuits on the table with a piece of hard cheese and the first of the beans ladled out. He sat down, looked at it. They'll be better when I know what you have in the cellar, she said. This is fine, he said, and she could tell by how he ate that it was actually true, or at least truer than the politeness required. He ate with the focused attention of a man who'd been feeding himself adequately, but not well for too long. They didn't talk much at the table. That was all right. She'd come here to work, not to perform the social niceties of a woman trying to prove herself agreeable, and he seemed to understand that in the same way he seemed to understand most things, quietly, without requiring it to be explained. When he pushed back his chair and stood, he said, "The woodpile needs splitting before the weather turns. I'll do that this afternoon. If you want to take a look at the cellar, there's a door behind the house, east side." "I'll do that," she said. He put his hat on and went back outside. Clara sat at the table for a moment after he'd gone. The house was quiet except for the fire in the stove and the distant sound of cattle, and the light coming through the east window was moving west now, afternoon gold instead of morning white. She thought about Warren Alcott standing in front of his bank that morning, and she thought about what it had felt like to walk past him without slowing. And she thought about the way the hawk had been standing on that fence post so still you almost didn't see it, just another shape in the landscape until you were right on top of it. She'd had a plan when she got on that train, a clear, sensible plan that she'd built across 7 months of letters and careful saving and arranging and hoping. That plan was gone. It had evaporated in a single sentence on a public train platform, and she was sitting now in a stranger's kitchen with 30 cents less than she'd had 3 days ago, wearing an apron that had belonged to a dead woman, working out how to make flour and beans in a wood stove, carry her through to the point where the arithmetic made sense again. She had been in worse positions. She reminded herself of that. She stood up, cleared the table, went to find the cellar behind the house. The door was where he'd said it was. She pulled it open and descended into the cool dark and stood there letting her eyes adjust, looking at what was there. More than she'd expected. Less than was comfortable for winter, but more than nothing. She started making a list in her head. What was there? What was needed? What she'd have to ask about, and what she could manage without asking. Outside, the sound of the axe started. Gideon at the woodpile, working with the steady rhythm of a man who was accustomed to the labor and had put himself to it without drama. Clara counted the jars on the shelves and committed the numbers to memory. She was going to be all right. She wasn't sure of much in Red Hollow, Wyoming territory, on the 4th day of October, 1883, but she was sure enough of that. She climbed back out of the cellar, closed the door behind her, and went back into the house to start on the kitchen. The cellar had more than she'd initially thought, but not enough to be comfortable about it, and that distinction mattered once she started doing the real accounting. She spent the first 3 days at the Hale Ranch the way she spent most new situations, quietly, methodically, and without asking for more guidance than she actually needed. She mapped the house the way she'd learned to map places that were going to matter to her survival, where the drafts came in, which floorboards were unreliable, how the stove behaved at different temperatures, what the well situation was and how far it was from the house, and whether the rope on the bucket was the kind of rope that would hold through winter or the kind that was going to let go at the worst possible moment. It would let go. She replaced it on the second day using a length from the barn that Gideon said he could spare. He didn't ask why she was doing half of what she did. That suited her. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized the kitchen, scrubbed the stove to a condition where it burned cleanly instead of sulking and producing more smoke than heat, inventoried everything in the cellar twice, and written the results on a piece of paper she tacked to the inside of the cellar door, and begun a list of what they would need before the first hard freeze arrived. She put the list on the kitchen table one evening after supper, and Gideon looked at it without speaking for a long moment. "That's more than I was planning to spend," he said finally. "I know." She sat down across from him. "How much were you planning to spend?" He named a figure. She looked at the list and looked back at him. "Then we cut here, here, and here," she said, pointing. "Not here, because we'll need that or we'll regret it in January. Not this either, but these 3 we can manage without if we're careful." He studied the revised version she'd indicated. "You know about frontier winters?" "I know about being cold when you didn't prepare well enough," she said. "Close enough." He didn't smile, but something in his face shifted slightly, the way a door shifts in a frame when the pressure on it changes without actually opening. "I'll go into town Thursday," he said. "I'd rather you sent someone else," she said, "if that's possible." He looked up. "Pruitt told me he didn't want to complicate his relationship with Warren Alcott," she said. If you go in on my account, it might cost you more than the supplies." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Pruitt and I have our own difficulties that predate you." "I know, I saw some of that in the alley." He seemed to consider whether to say more about it, and decided against it, which she respected. "I'll go Thursday," he said. "It doesn't change." He went Thursday. He came back with most of what she'd listed and a face that was carefully neutral in the way faces get when something has happened that the person doesn't intend to talk about. She unloaded the wagon without asking, and he unhitched the horses without explaining, and by supper the matter sat between them unaddressed and eventually dissolved into the ordinary business of the evening. She found out 3 days later from a ranch hand named Tomas, who was the only consistent hired help Gideon had managed to keep through the summer, that Pruitt had indeed refused to fill the full order, and that Gideon had ridden another 4 miles to a smaller trading post run by a Basque family named Iriarte, who had filled the rest without comment or condition. Tomas was 17 and had come north from New Mexico with a family that had since dispersed in various directions, and he had the quality that some very young people have of saying true things without understanding they're being diplomatic. He told Clara about the Iriarte trip the same way he told her the hay in the east barn was getting damp, as a piece of practical information she might find useful, offered without editorializing. "Pruitt do this kind of thing often?" she asked. "More since Mr. Alcott started coming around town more," Tomas said, and then went back to mending the fence section he'd been working on, which told her she'd gotten all she was going to get on the subject. The learning curve was steeper than she'd anticipated, and she'd anticipated it being steep. She could cook. That had never been the question. But cooking in a frontier kitchen for people who needed real fuel in their bodies. Not the careful small portions of a boarding house table, but the kind of food that had to carry a man through 10 hours of physical labor and cold, that was already settling into the low 40s at night and going to get considerably worse, was a different discipline than she'd practiced before, and she was honest enough with herself about that to pay attention. The riding was harder. She had been on horses before, but not regularly, and not working horses, and not in terrain that was unfamiliar. And on the 3rd week, Gideon told her she needed to be able to get between the house and the pasture on horseback because there were going to be mornings when he needed her to do that. He said it practically, as an operational requirement, not as a criticism. But the first 3 times she tried to manage the smaller horse, a brown mare named Dix, who was patient but had opinions about the pace. She came back to the house sore in places she hadn't previously known she could be sore, and with a bruise on her left forearm from where she'd caught it on a gate latch she hadn't managed in time. "You're fighting her," Gideon said, watching from the corral fence while she dismounted with the controlled care of someone whose legs hurt. "I'm not fighting her. You're bracing against every movement instead of going with it. She can feel that. She has very strong feelings about things. She's a horse. She has instincts." He pushed off the fence and came over and adjusted her grip on the reins in a way that was purely mechanical. Where to hold, how loose, the angle of the wrist, without any of the condescension that kind of correction often carried. "You're telling her you don't trust her. She agrees with you and doesn't trust you back. That's all that's happening." She tried it his way on the 4th attempt, and Dick's was, without any other change, significantly easier to manage, which was both gratifying and irritating in the way that correct advice always is when you'd been resisting it. She kept practicing, not because it stopped hurting, but because she was not going to be the kind of person who stopped practicing because something hurt. Red Hollow's opinions about her new situation became apparent gradually, and then all at once. The gradual part was the way people in town looked at Gideon when he came in on supply runs, or the way Tomas reported that a few of the neighboring ranches had stopped sending men over for the informal labor exchanges that were common on the frontier. "You help us with the roundup, we'll help you with the fence repair," the kind of mutual dependence that worked because everyone was equally dependent on it. 2 of those arrangements simply didn't materialize in the first 2 weeks of October in ways they'd apparently materialized reliably the previous years. The all-at-once part was a Saturday afternoon when Clara rode into Red Hollow with Gideon because she needed thread for repairs she couldn't put off, and he'd said it was fine, she should come. She understood about 3 minutes after they arrived on the main street that it was not fine in the way he'd meant. Not because of anything Gideon did. He was the same as he always was, which was steady and unreadable and unhurried, but because of what happened around them. The woman outside the mercantile who turned deliberately and went inside when she saw Clara climb down from the wagon seat. The two men in front of the barber shop who stopped their conversation and watched without the basic social courtesy of pretending they weren't watching. Mrs. Calloway, Warren Alcott's sister, who came down the far side of the street with two other women and didn't lower her voice when she said something that Clara couldn't hear, but that made all three of them look directly at her, and then look at each other with the particular shared expression of women who have reached a conclusion and are pleased with themselves about it. Clara got her thread. She said nothing to any of them and made no expressions that anyone could interpret, and got back in the wagon, and Gideon drove them out of town at the same pace he'd driven them in. "I can get supplies from the Iriarte trading post," she said, when they were out on the North Road. "You don't have to bring me to town." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'm saying it might be simpler." "Simpler for who?" She looked at him. He was looking at the road. "They were going to have opinions regardless," he said. "They had opinions before you arrived. This just gives them a new subject. Having a woman living on your ranch who was publicly rejected by Warren Alcott is a more specific subject than the general kind," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "But I've found that people who want to make your life difficult will find a reason to do it. Trying to remove all the reasons generally doesn't help as much as you'd think." She didn't answer immediately. There was something in what he said that she recognized. Not wisdom, exactly, but the particular exhausted pragmatism of someone who had spent time learning that lesson the hard way. "How long have they been making your life difficult?" she asked. "Since I wouldn't sell my eastern pasture to a man who wanted it and who doesn't like being told no." He adjusted the reins. "About 3 years." "Warren Alcott?" He nodded once. "And now you've taken me on." "Now I've taken you on." No inflection on it, just a statement. "That was either very principled or very unwise," she said. He almost smiled. She saw the edge of it, and then it was gone. "Might be both," he said. November came in cold and then got colder, and the rhythm of the ranch settled into something that had less to do with her plan for how it would go and more to do with what each day actually required. She rose before dawn because the kitchen needed to be warm before the men came in for breakfast, and she went to bed after dark because the day didn't stop until it stopped. She learned, against her earlier expectations, that she was capable of real physical labor on a sustained basis, not because she hadn't worked hard before, but because the kind of work this was, the kind that was always being undone by weather and livestock and the basic intractability of materials, required a different orientation than she'd had. You couldn't complete it. You could only manage it day to day and come back the next morning and manage it again. There was something both defeating and oddly freeing about that once she accepted it. The town's boycott, she'd started calling it that in her own head because that's what it was, whether or not anyone would use the word, tightened through November in ways that were felt at the ranch in small, practical terms. The arrangement with Pruitt effectively ended, which meant supplies cost more because the Iriarte trading post was farther. 2 more of the neighboring ranch labor arrangements fell through. The man who usually came to shoe the horses in the fall sent word that he was occupied and couldn't make it, and Gideon spent 2 days doing it himself with a set of tools that worked but weren't ideal and a vocabulary that was more varied when applied to horseshoeing than Clara had expected from him. She found him at the barn one evening in the second week of November, sitting on an upturned bucket with his hands open on his knees, looking at the middle distance in the way people look when they are calculating and don't like the results. "Tell me what the actual number is," she said. "You don't need to—" "Gideon!" She sat down on a hay bale across from him. "Tell me the number." He told her. It was bad. Not catastrophic, not yet, but it was the kind of number that became catastrophic by February if nothing changed. She sat with it for a moment. "What do you have that they don't?" He looked at her. "What?" "The neighboring ranches, the people in town who are dependent on Alcott's goodwill. What do you have that they can't get from them?" She was thinking out loud, which was a habit that sometimes produced useful things and sometimes produced nothing, but this time she could feel something forming at the edge of it. What do they need before winter that no one else has in sufficient supply? He was quiet for a moment. "We have hay," he said slowly. "More than we'll use if the herd stays stable. The early cutting was good this year. And their cuttings? Mixed. 2 of them had wet fields in August, lost some. So they need hay. Some of them. And you have it. He looked at her with the gray, considering eyes he had. They won't buy from me. Alcott, what if it wasn't about buying? She worked through it. What if you lent the hay in exchange for labor this winter? Fence repairs, the shoeing that didn't happen, other things that need doing. Not money, not charity. A fair exchange of what each side has and needs. She paused. They can tell themselves it was practical and not have to explain to Alcott why they bought from Hale. And you get what you need. He looked at the middle distance again for a long time. They'd still know, he said. They'd know they kept their cattle alive through winter, she said. People are more flexible about their principles when livestock is involved. This time, he did actually almost smile, and didn't pull it back quite as quickly. Where'd you come by that particular wisdom? I grew up on a farm, she said. Before things went differently. He didn't ask her to elaborate. She was grateful for that. I'll think on it, he said. Think fast, she said. It's November, Sham. She rode out to the Pierce Ranch herself, which was the one she'd identified as the most likely candidate. They'd had the worst of the wet August, from what Tomas had mentioned, and their cattle numbers were substantial enough that a hay shortage would hurt them badly. Pierce himself, whose name was Douglas, and who had the thick neck and suspicious eyes of a man who'd been in frontier disputes before and had the posture to prove it, looked at her from his porch with an expression she was beginning to recognize. The look of someone who has decided to categorize you before giving you a chance to speak. She didn't give him time to speak first. She told him what they had, what she understood his situation was, and what the arrangement she was proposing would mean in practical terms. She said it plainly and without apology, because she'd found that apologizing for a fair offer usually made people think it was worse than it was. Pierce was quiet when she finished. Hale send you? I'm here on behalf of the ranch, she said. If you want to negotiate with Gideon directly after this, that's fine. It's an odd thing, Pierce said, leaning against his porch post, having a woman come negotiate a hay arrangement. It would be odder if your cattle starved because you were waiting for a man to ask you, she said. He blinked. I'm not trying to be unkind, she added. I'm saying it's a fair arrangement, and the mathematics work in your favor, and it's November. Pierce scratched the back of his neck, looked at the corral, where his cattle were visible through the fence, looked back at her. I'd want to verify the hay stock before I agreed to anything. That's reasonable, she said. Come Thursday. He came Thursday. He brought his foreman, who poked through the hay with the professional suspicion of someone who did not intend to be fooled, and eventually nodded with the minimal acknowledgement of a man who had been expecting to find a problem and hadn't. By Friday, they had an agreement, verbal and handshake, which was how agreements worked out here. Within a week, a second ranch had sent word, then a third. Gideon came into the kitchen one evening while she was working and stood in the doorway for a moment. The Callahan place wants to talk about fence repairs in exchange for hay, he said. I know, Mrs. Callahan sent word this afternoon. He looked at her. You've been managing this whole thing, haven't you? It wasn't quite a question. Someone had to, she said. You were doing the horseshoeing. He leaned against the doorframe and she could see him working something out internally, some recalibration of who she was relative to who he'd thought she was when she'd arrived with a broken suitcase and a cord holding it shut. She understood the feeling. She'd done it herself, with him, several times over the past weeks. I want to be clear about something, he said after a moment. She turned to face him properly. All right, I didn't hire you because I felt sorry for you. I hired you because I needed the help and you were honest with me about your situation. He paused. But what you've done here, the hay arrangements, the Iriarte connection, the supply management, that's not what I hired you for. I know, she said. I want to compensate you differently for it. I don't need charity. It's not charity. I just said that. He didn't raise his voice or shift his expression, just held his ground in the mild, immovable way he had. It's what the work is worth. She was quiet for a moment. Through the kitchen window, the night was solid black and very cold, the stars hard and clear the way they got before the temperature dropped seriously. I'll think about it, she said, which was the closest she'd come in a long time to saying yes to something before she'd worked out every possible reason it might go wrong. He nodded. Supper ready? 10 minutes. He went back out to the porch to wash up, and Clara turned back to the stove. Outside, the wind had picked up from the north, carrying the specific quality of cold that meant this wasn't a night cold, but a weather cold, the kind that came before something. She'd grown up enough to know the difference. She put another piece of wood on the fire and didn't think about Warren Alcott once in the remainder of the evening, which was, she realized, the first time she'd been able to say that since she'd stepped off the train. The weather cold she'd sensed that November evening turned out to be the opening act of something considerably larger. The first real snow came on a Thursday, which was inconvenient because Tomas had gone to visit his cousin in Cheyenne and wasn't due back until Sunday, and Gideon had ridden out early to check the cattle in the north pasture because two of them had been showing signs of something he couldn't quite diagnose and wanted to assess before the temperature dropped further. Clara was alone in this house when the sky went from gray to white in about 40 minutes, and the wind shifted direction in the way that means the shift is permanent, at least for the next several days. She did what needed doing. She brought in enough wood to last 3 days, which required 4 trips to the woodpile and a 5th trip for the smaller pieces that the kitchen stove preferred for morning fires. She checked the water situation and filled every container she had. She fed the 2 horses that were in the near corral, Dix and an older gelding named Cobb that Gideon kept for the heavy pulling work, and made sure they had enough in the hay bin to last if someone couldn't get to them the next morning. The snow was serious by noon. By 2 in the afternoon, it was the kind of snow that makes the world disappear outside of about 30 feet, and Gideon had not come back. She waited another hour, feeding the stove and finishing the mending she'd been putting off, and not letting herself look at the window every 5 minutes, because looking at the window every 5 minutes was not going to do anything useful. She ate something small at 3 because she'd learned in the past weeks that skipping meals made her less capable of dealing with problems, not more stoic, which was the thing you usually told yourself when you skipped them. At 4, she put on every layer she had and went out to the barn to saddle Dix. The barn was warmer than outside, which was a relative term. The horses were restless in the way animals get when the pressure changes, moving in their stalls and exhaling long, cloudy breaths. Clara saddled Dix with the care she'd developed over the past 6 weeks, checking the girth twice, adjusting the stirrups to where she needed them, talking to the horse not because she believed Dix understood her, but because the sound of a calm voice seemed to help, and she was not above using what worked. "I know," she told Dix, when the mare shifted her weight and tossed her head. "I don't want to do this either." She led Dix outside, mounted with the efficiency she'd been building since October, and pointed north. The snow was mid-cannon on Dix's legs within the first quarter mile, which meant it was deeper in the low spots, and probably worse in the north pasture, which was lower ground. The wind was coming directly at them, and Clara kept her face turned slightly to the side, and her eyes narrowed to slits and trusted Dix to hold the direction because she could barely see 20 feet ahead, and the horse's instincts were more reliable than her navigation in conditions like this. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice. The sound of Gideon's horse, the dark bay called Remington, moving somewhere to her left in a way that didn't sound right, the gait broken and uneven. She turned Dix toward it, and Remington came out of the white in pieces. First the dark shape of him, then Gideon leaning low over his neck, then the detail that Gideon's left leg was hanging at an angle that wasn't the way a person sits a horse. "Stop," she said, which was directed at Dix and worked. She rode up alongside Remington and put her hand on his bridle because he was nervous and tired and sliding a little on whatever was under the snow. "What happened?" It wasn't a question. Questions take time. "Fence wire," Gideon said through clenched teeth. Remington went down. I went with him. He shifted slightly and made a sound he clearly hadn't meant to make. "Ankle, I think. Maybe more." "Can you ride?" "I'm riding." "Can you ride another 2 miles?" A pause that was longer than she liked. "Yes." She wasn't entirely sure he was telling the truth, but she was also not in a position to do much about it if he wasn't. She kept Dix alongside Remington and held Remington's bridle loosely, not steering him, just maintaining contact, because the horse seemed to settle with her there. And they moved south through the snow at the reduced pace that was all Remington was willing to manage. It took 40 minutes to cover what should have been 20 minutes of ground. By the time the house came into shape through the white, the light was gone from the sky completely, and Clara's hands had passed the stage of cold that hurts, and into the stage that worries her more, where they felt thick and distant, and she had to look at them to be sure they were doing what she told them to. She got the horses into the barn. Gideon tried to dismount on his own, and she let him try until it became clear that he was going to hurt himself worse. And then she was under his arm and taking weight without asking permission, because this was not the moment for either of them to have feelings about it. "I can," he started. "You can when we're inside," she said. "Move your left foot forward." He moved it, made the sound again. They got to the house. She put him in the chair nearest the stove because it was the warmest place in the room, and pulled his boot off with the careful firmness of someone who knows that slow and careful is faster than fast and rough when there's an injury involved. And he gripped the arms of the chair and looked at the ceiling and didn't say anything while she did it, which she respected because she knew what it was costing him. The ankle was swollen badly and already coloring into something spectacular. She didn't know if it was broken or only badly sprained, and in practical terms, the distinction didn't change what she could do about it tonight, which was wrap it tightly with strips of cloth she cut from a piece of old sheeting, elevate it on a second chair, and put hot water on for tea because his hands were cold and he'd been out in that wind for hours. "Cattle?" she asked while she worked. "The sick ones are... I got them into the South Gully before the weather came down. It's some shelter there." He paused. "The main herd should be all right if the snow doesn't last more than 2 days. What's your read on how long it lasts?" 3 days, he said. "Maybe 4. She tied off the wrapping and looked up at him. "Then we have a problem." "I know. Can you get to the barn on that foot tomorrow?" He looked at his ankle with the expression of a man running calculations he doesn't like. "I can get there." "That's not the same as whether you should." "No," he said. "It's not." She made the tea. She brought him a plate of what was left from midday because he hadn't eaten since morning, and that was going to make everything worse. And she sat down across from him at the table and thought through what the next 3 days were going to require. "Tell me what the cattle need if I'm doing it," she said. "All of it. Don't assume I know something I might not know." He looked at her for a moment. "You've never worked cattle." "I've been here 2 months, and I've watched you work them, and I learned fast." "Tell me," he told her. It took a while, and she asked questions when she needed to, and he answered without simplifying or talking slowly the way men sometimes did when they explained things to her, which meant either he'd noticed she didn't need that, or he was in enough pain that he didn't have the energy for it. Either way, she was grateful. By the time the stove had warmed the room to something genuinely habitable, she had a workable picture of what the next 3 days required. It was not a comfortable picture, but it was clear, and she could work with clear. "You should sleep," she said. I checked everything before I came out to find you," she said. "The horses are settled. The wood will last 3 days. You should sleep." He looked at her with the gray eyes that she'd learned over 2 months could contain quite a lot without expressing any of it obviously. "You rode out to find me. You were 2 hours overdue. In a blizzard. It wasn't a full blizzard yet when I left." She stood and started clearing the table. "It was just very bad weather." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara." She turned. "Thank you," he said. Simply, without elaboration, in the way he said most important things. "Get some sleep," she said, and went to bank the stove for the night. She was up before 4 the next morning. The wind had not stopped. She dressed in every layer she owned, plus a coat of Gideon's she found on the hook by the door. It was enormous on her and smelled of wood smoke and horses and something she didn't try to name. And she went out to the barn in the dark to start on what needed doing. The horses first, then the milk cow, whose name she'd never actually asked, and who she'd been privately calling Margaret, because the animal had the dignified, suffering expression of a Margaret. Then the check on the South Gully, where the sick cattle were sheltering, which required her to break through a knee-high drift that had formed against the fence line, and which filled her boots with snow within the first 30 seconds, and after which her feet were in the category of deeply unhappy, but functional. The sick cattle were alive, which was the primary requirement. She threw hay to them from the stack Gideon had pulled up near the gully in autumn, which she now understood had been deliberate forward planning rather than accident, and she counted them twice because she'd been told there were 7, and she kept getting 6 until she found the 7th one tucked behind the others. Alive, but not enthusiastic about it. She got back to the house by 7, changed her wet stockings for the only dry pair she had, put the wet ones over a chair near the stove to dry, and made breakfast. Gideon was up, which she hadn't expected. He'd managed to get himself to the table using a length of board as a crutch, and he was sitting in the same chair as the night before with his leg elevated and an expression that suggested the ankle had continued to have opinions overnight. "You should be in bed," she said. "I've been in bed," he said. "Cattle?" "All present, the 7 in the south gully, including the one that wasn't obvious. Main herd I couldn't count from where I was. Visibility's still bad, but they were moving, which I took as a reasonable sign." He exhaled. "Good. The sick one at the back of the group has a fever, I think. It felt warm when I got close enough. And its breathing is off." "Which one?" "The smaller black one. There's a notch in its left ear." He closed his eyes briefly, which told her that meant something specific and probably not good. "She was the one I was worried about before. If she doesn't improve by tomorrow, she might not improve." "All right," Clara said. "I'll check her again at noon." She set his breakfast in front of him. He looked at her. At the coat she was still wearing, his coat, which was still slightly damp at the hem from the morning's work. "That fits you poorly," he said. "It's warm," she said, and sat down to her own breakfast. Bosham. The 3 days of the storm became 4, and then a 5th, and the 5th day was the bad one. The morning of the 5th day, she went out to find that the roof of the smaller outbuilding, the one they used for storing equipment, and which had been on her mental list of things that needed attention before winter and had not gotten sufficient attention, had given way under the snow load. Not completely, but enough that the structure was no longer sound, and the equipment inside was exposed, and the whole thing needed to be addressed before the temperature dropped again tonight, which by the feel of the sky it was going to do. She stood in front of it in Gideon's coat and assessed what could be moved, what could be covered with the canvas tarpaulins from the barn, and what was simply going to have to be a loss. And then she went and got the tarpaulins. Gideon saw her coming in with the first load of rescued tools and stood up from his chair, which he'd been moving around with diminishing assistance from the board crutch as the days had passed. "Don't," she said. "The roof—" "I know. I'm handling it. Sit down before you undo the wrapping on that ankle, and we have a worse problem than a broken outbuilding. Clara, you can't move all of that yourself." "I'm not moving all of it. I'm covering what I can't move." She set down the tools she'd carried and turned to go back. "Half an hour and it's sorted." It took closer to an hour, and it wasn't sorted so much as managed. The tarpaulins secured over the worst of the exposed equipment with rocks from the yard holding down the edges. The tools she'd been able to carry stacked in the barn's dry corner. The structure itself left to be dealt with properly when the snow eased, and there was more than one person able to work it. But when she came back in the final time and stood by the stove thawing her hands out and inventorying whether anything important had been lost, the answer was not much. A set of harness pieces that were probably beyond repair anyway. A wooden box that had gotten wet enough to be suspect. Gideon was standing in the kitchen doorway. "You were supposed to sit," she said. "I did sit. For 4 days." He looked at her hands, which were red and clumsy from the cold. "Come here." She looked at him. "Your hands," he said. "Come here." She crossed the room and he took both of her hands in his and held them cupped between his palms, which were warm. Genuinely warm, in the way that a person's hands are warm when they've been inside for 4 days. And the contrast against her frozen fingers was sharp enough that she almost said something, but didn't. He didn't do anything with the gesture except hold them. No rubbing, no fussing, just held them until the cold started to retreat. She became aware standing there of several things simultaneously, that the kitchen was small, that they were standing close, that she hadn't been touched by another person with any kind of care in a very long time, and that this was the kind of moment she was not certain what to do with. He seemed to become aware of the same set of things at roughly the same moment, because he released her hands and stepped back, and they both looked at the stove for a moment as though it were interesting. "You should eat something," she said. "I ate." "More than what you ate." He almost smiled. There it was, the edge of it, and this time it lasted a fraction of a second longer before it went. "I'll make something." "You'll sit down and I'll make something," she said, "because your ankle is not healed and I need you to be functional when the snow clears, so stop trying to prove a point to yourself and sit." He sat. She made soup because she could make it from what they had, and it was warming, and it didn't require her to do complicated things with hands that were still partially uncooperative. The 5th day ended with the wind gentling slightly, which Gideon said meant the back end of the system was passing through. The The sixth morning she went out and the snow had stopped and the sky was that particular sharp blue that comes after bad weather, the color of something cleared and starting over. When Thomas came back from Cheyenne 4 days later than planned because the weather had caught him there, he took one look at the salvaged outbuilding, the neat stacks of equipment in the barn, and Clara's systematic reorganization of everything that had needed doing during the storm days, and said, with the simple honesty he had, "You did all of this?" "Most of it," she said. He shook his head slowly. "I thought maybe Mr. Hale—" Mr. Hale had a busted ankle. Tomas looked toward the house and then back at her. "Is he all right?" "He's walking on it, carefully." Tomas was quiet for a moment in the way he got when he was processing something that didn't fit the category he'd previously put it in. "You went out in that storm to find him," he said. It was the kind of sentence that isn't really a statement, but isn't quite a question. "He was 2 hours overdue," she said, and picked up the bucket she'd been about to carry to the barn. "Miss Whitmore," Tomas said. She stopped. "There's talk in town," he said. "I heard it on the way back through. About you and Mr. Hale, about what people are saying about the arrangement." He wasn't looking at her directly, which told her he was uncomfortable with the subject, and was saying it anyway because he thought she should know. "Mrs. Calloway's been talking, and Mr. Alcott, people say he's going to move against the ranch somehow. The land, or the loan, or something." She'd been expecting something like this. Not the specific shape of it, but the fact of it. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I thought you should know." "I appreciate it." She looked at him. 17 years old, a long way from the family he'd come north with, doing his level best to do right by the people he worked for. "How was your cousin?" His face changed entirely. "She had the baby. A girl. They named her Rosa." "That's wonderful news," Clara said, and meant it. He smiled with the full, unguarded happiness of someone who wasn't yet old enough to contain good news behind a careful expression. She carried the bucket to the barn and let him tell her the rest of it, and didn't let herself think about Warren Alcott or Mrs. Calloway or the shape of what was coming until she was back in the house alone that evening and the day's work was done. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and thought about it. The hay arrangement had worked. She knew that 3 of the neighboring ranches had taken it, the labor exchanges had happened as agreed, and the ranch had ended November in a better financial position than it had started it. That was real. What was also real was that Tomas was right, and she'd known it herself. Warren Alcott was not a man who accepted inconvenience without responding to it. He had the resources and the temperament and the particular pride of a man who had been told no in small ways for a long time by Gideon Hale, and now had an additional grievance in the shape of her. Gideon came into the kitchen at some point while she was sitting there. He'd stopped using the board as a crutch 2 days ago and was walking with a limp that he was carrying off with the determined disregard of a man who preferred not to admit it was there. "You're not eating," he said. "I was thinking about Tomas's news." It wasn't a question. "He told you what he heard in town." "He told me." Gideon pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "I expected something like this. He said Alcott might move against the loan. I've been behind on the banknote for 6 months. He's had grounds to move for a while. He's been choosing not to." He spread his hands on the table, large, calloused hands with a new scar across the back of the right one from the fence wire incident. "I think he's been waiting for the right moment, the right reason. And now he has one. Maybe." He was quiet for a moment. "It changes what the situation is. I want you to know that I understand that. If staying here creates difficulties that are—" "I went out in a blizzard to find you," she said. "I managed the ranch alone for 5 days. I negotiated hay arrangements with 3 ranchers who didn't like me. I'm not leaving because Warren Alcott is going to make things difficult." She looked at him directly. "I'm past the point where leaving makes sense." He held her gaze for a moment. "Then we need to figure out what we do about the note," he said. "Yes," she said. "We do. I have the cattle to sell in spring. If the prices hold, I can clear most of it." "And if Alcott calls the note before spring?" He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. She thought about the Iriarte family at the trading post, who had filled Gideon's supply order when Pruitt wouldn't. She thought about Douglas Pierce checking the haystock with his skeptical foreman and shaking hands on an agreement he'd followed through on without complaint. She thought about Dora Mackle at the saloon, who had said, "I'll see what I can do," in a way that wasn't entirely hopeless. How many people in this territory actually want Alcott to have more control than he already does? She asked. Gideon considered, "Not as many as he thinks." "Then that's where we start," she said. "Not with fighting him directly, with making sure that the people who don't want him to win have a reason to say so. People don't put themselves at risk over principle." "No," she agreed, "but they'll act when they have something concrete to gain or lose." She thought of Pierce's cattle, the Iriarte trading post, which relied on ranchers like Gideon who didn't deal exclusively through Alcott's preferred merchants, the small ranchers who'd been losing ground to consolidation for 3 years. "We have more allies than we realize. We just haven't given them a reason to stand up yet." Gideon was watching her with the particular attention he had when she was working through something he hadn't reached himself. Not skeptical, not admiring either, just present, the way he was present for most things, fully, without performance. "You've been building toward this since the Hay arrangement," he said. "I've been building toward surviving," she said. "This is just what surviving looks like at this particular stage." He nodded once. Outside, the night was clear and very cold, the stars doing what they did in Wyoming after a storm, spread across the sky with a density that felt excessive, like the dark was trying to make up for the 5 days it had spent hidden behind clouds. "We should sleep," he said. "There's a lot to do tomorrow." "There's always a lot to do tomorrow," she said. He stood, and she stood, and they went their separate ways in the small house that had become, without either of them having intended it precisely, something that felt less like an arrangement and more like a life. And neither of them said anything about that, because some things on the frontier you simply acknowledge by continuing to show up for them day after day until the showing up becomes its own kind of answer. The letter from Warren Alcott's bank arrived on a Monday in the second week of December, which was either coincidental timing or deliberate, and Clara had stopped believing in coincidences where Alcott was concerned sometime around the third week of November. Gideon read it at the kitchen table with the particular stillness of a man who has been expecting bad news and is now doing the work of absorbing the exact shape of it. He set it down. He picked up his coffee cup and found it empty and set it back down. Clara refilled it without being asked and sat across from him and waited. "He's calling the note," Gideon said. "Full balance, 60 days. "How much?" He told her. It was not a small number. It was the kind of number that 60 days from the second week of December landed in the second week of February, which was the deepest part of winter, which was not an accident either. "Can you sell cattle in February?" she asked. "Not at a price that covers this. Spring is when the prices are right. He knows that." Gideon folded the letter along its original crease and set it on the table beside his coffee cup. "If I can't pay by the date he's set, he has grounds to move against the property. The eastern pasture, or more." He looked out the window at the yard, where Tomas was splitting wood in the cold morning air, his breath coming in short white bursts. He's been patient about this for 3 years because it suited him to be patient. Now it doesn't suit him anymore. Clara was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about what she'd said the night after Tomas came back from Cheyenne, about allies, about giving people a reason to stand up. She'd spent the 2 weeks since then doing the preliminary work of that, in small ways, through conversations and arrangements, and the kind of relationship building that didn't look like strategy when you were in the middle of it, but was. She'd talked to Elena Iriarte, who ran the trading post alongside her husband and who had a clear and unsentimental view of how Alcott's influence in the territory affected businesses like theirs. She'd written a letter to Douglas Pierce that was ostensibly about the spring labor arrangement, but was also, if read carefully, something more than that. She'd had a longer conversation with Dora Mackle on the one occasion she'd been in town since the storm, and Dora had said things that suggested her earlier, "I'll see what I can do," had been more than politeness. None of it was fast enough to address 60 days and a banknote. "There's a man in Cheyenne," she said. Gideon looked at her. "A lawyer. His name is Aldous Fenn. He worked a land case 3 years ago in Carbon County that involved a creditor calling a note under conditions that the court found were designed to force a sale rather than recover a legitimate debt." She paused. "Tomas's cousin knows his clerk. That's how I heard about him." Gideon was very still in the way he got when something surprised him, and he was deciding how to respond to it. "You've been looking into this." Since Tomas told us about Alcott's intentions, yes. How long have you been? 2 weeks. She met his eyes. I wasn't sure it would come to this. Now I'm sure. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through the various things he might say about the fact that she'd been preparing for a legal fight on behalf of his ranch without telling him. She waited for him to land somewhere. What did this Fen say? He said. I haven't contacted him yet. I wanted to see what the actual situation was before I went that far. She nodded toward the letter. Now I know. He looked at the letter. A lawyer in Cheyenne costs money I don't have. I know that too. She'd been thinking about this part. The Iriarte family has a connection to a ranchers cooperative in Laramie County that has a legal fund for exactly this kind of case. Bank overreach on frontier notes. Elena mentioned it. I think they'd consider backing the legal costs if the case was strong enough and the precedent was useful enough to them. Gideon stared at her for a long moment. Outside, Tomas's axe hit the wood with the steady rhythm of someone who didn't know the world was being reorganized inside the kitchen. You've built an entire architecture around this, Gideon said. Not accusatory. More like a man noticing a structure he hadn't realized was being constructed. I've been building options, she said. I didn't know which ones we'd need. He picked up his coffee cup, set it down. What do you need from me? A letter from you to Fen explaining the history of the note, the terms of the original loan, and the relationship between Alcott and the Eastern Pasture dispute. Detailed and factual, nothing emotional. She paused. And I need you to be honest with me about whether there's anything in the loan history that gives Alcott a legitimate grievance. Anything I don't know. He was quiet for a moment. I was late twice in the first year. Drought. I made it up over the following 6 months. Is that documented? I have receipts. Then it's not a problem. She folded her hands on the table. Write the letter today. I'll get it to Cheyenne by the end of the week. He looked at her across the kitchen table in the thin December morning light. Clara, what you've been doing since October, you understand that's more than what I hired you for. You mentioned wanting to compensate me differently, she said. Back in November. I did. I haven't answered that yet. I noticed. She had not answered it because she hadn't known what the right answer was, and she was not in the habit of answering questions before she knew, because premature answers had cost her before in ways she hadn't fully recovered from. But sitting here with the bank's letter on the table between them and 2 months of building something real behind her, she thought she was beginning to understand what the answer was. Write the letter, she said. We'll talk about the rest after. He nodded and got up to find paper. The response from Aldous Fen came back in 9 days, which was faster than she'd expected, and suggested either that Tomas's cousin had represented the situation effectively to his clerk, or that Fen was the kind of lawyer who moved quickly when he saw something interesting. The letter was 3 pages, written in a dense and precise hand that Clara read twice through before she let herself have an opinion about it. The opinion she formed was cautiously positive. Fen had looked at the terms she'd outlined, the history of the note, the specific timing of the call, and the long-standing dispute over the Eastern Pasture, and he thought there was a case. Not a certain case. He was careful about that, and she respected him for it, but a case worth making. He outlined 2 legal arguments, one stronger and one that he called a secondary position, and he named a fee structure that was high but not impossible, particularly if the cooperative's fund was accessible. Elena Iriarte drove out to the ranch the following Tuesday with her husband Marco, who was a quiet man with a detailed understanding of how Alcott's banking practices affected the territory's independent merchants, and they sat at Gideon's kitchen table and went through Fen's letter together. Marco asked careful questions. Elena listened to the answers. At the end of it, Marco said he'd bring the case to the cooperative's board in Laramie, and Elena said she thought the board would say yes, and both of them said it in a way that suggested they had some influence over whether the board said yes, which Clara filed away as relevant. What she did not file away because she couldn't put it down was what happened after the Iriartes left. Gideon was standing at the door watching their wagon go down the road toward town, and she was at the table collecting the papers, and he turned from the door and said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to understand that however you answer it, the arrangement we have doesn't change. I mean that, and I need you to believe I mean it before I ask. She set the papers down. All right. He came back to the table but didn't sit. He was doing the thing with his hands, not the hat, since he wasn't wearing one, but a similar rotation of his fingers against each other that she'd seen before when he was thinking through something difficult. People in town are going to use this, the legal fight, the fact that you're here, to say things that make the situation worse. Mrs. Calloway's already been saying them. Alcott is going to use whatever he can. He paused. The most direct way to remove one of his arguments is to change the nature of what the arrangement is. She waited. I'm not asking because it solves a problem, he said. I want to be clear on that. I'm asking because... He stopped. Started again, differently. 8 months ago, I thought the way I was living was just how it was going to be. Ellen was gone. The ranch was struggling. I was managing, and managing was going to be enough. He looked at her directly. Then you came here with a broken suitcase, and you went out in a blizzard to find me, and you built something out of what looked like nothing. And I am... Another stop. I would like to keep building it with you. That's what I'm asking. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She had not come to Wyoming Territory looking for this. She had come looking for a particular kind of security that had turned out to be illusory, and what she'd found instead was nothing she'd planned on. The work had been real. The cold had been real. The way she'd felt on the 5th day of the storm, standing in front of that collapsed outbuilding and making herself solve the problem in front of her rather than the one she was afraid of. That had been real in a way that very few things in her life had been. And he was real. Imperfect and sometimes infuriating in his reticence, and not a man who said more than he meant, but real in the way that mattered most. Which was that he meant what he said and said it straight, and had never once, in 2 months, made her feel like a problem he was managing. You're not good at asking for things, she said. He exhaled. No, I'm not. I noticed that in October. I know. All right, she said. He looked at her. All right, meaning yes. She picked the papers back up. We should get these to the post before the end of the week. He stood there for a moment with the look of a man who had been braced for a harder conversation and wasn't entirely sure what to do with the fact that it hadn't been. Then something in his face settled into something quieter and more genuine than she usually saw there, and he said, "Thank you," in the same simple way he'd said it the night she'd brought him in from the storm. Stop thanking me for things that make sense, she said. He almost smiled. The full thing, this time. Not just the edge of it. I'll try. They married on a Saturday in January with Tomas as witness and Elena Iriarte as the second, in front of the county clerk in Red Hollow, who was a man named Briggs that Clara had spoken to twice before, and who performed the civil ceremony with the efficient brevity of someone who had other things to do and did not invest the proceedings with more significance than was legally required. That was fine. The significance was already there. It didn't need ceremony to confirm it. What the ceremony did do, however, was exist on public record, which meant that when word reached Warren Alcott, and it reached him by that afternoon because Red Hollow was not a town that kept things quiet, he had to respond to a different situation than the one he'd been managing. Clara Whitmore, the rejected mail-order bride who had become an embarrassing fixture on Gideon Hale's struggling ranch, was now Clara Hale, which changed the legal landscape around the property question in ways that Fenn had pointed out in his second letter, and which Alcott's own lawyer presumably understood. The town's response was not unified, which was what she'd expected. Mrs. Calloway, encountered 2 days later outside the Mercantile, looked at Clara with the expression of a woman who has been running a particular narrative and has just found a significant plot problem. She said nothing, which was more interesting than anything she might have said, and walked past with her back very straight. Dora Mackle, at the saloon, poured her a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for and said, "About time," in the tone of someone delivering a verdict. Pruitt at the Mercantile continued to be cold. 3 other merchants were visibly uncertain, which Clara read as an improvement over cold. Douglas Pierce, encountered in the street on the same day, stopped and shook Gideon's hand with the solid grip of a man who was making a public statement with the gesture, and knew it. His foreman, standing behind him, nodded at Clara with the brief nod of someone who has revised an opinion and is acknowledging the revision without making a speech about it. Gideon noticed all of it. She could tell from the way he moved through town that day. Not differently, exactly, because he was not a man who changed his comportment for audiences, but with a slight easing somewhere around his shoulders that she thought probably nobody else would have caught. The formal confrontation came the following week. It came in the form of a meeting that was ostensibly a town council session, but was, in practical terms, an attempt by Warren Alcott and the men aligned with him to make official what gossip had been doing unofficially since October, which was to establish that Clara's presence on the Hale Ranch prior to the marriage had been improper, and that impropriety had implications for the standing of the ranch and its owner in the community. She found out about it from Tomas, who had it from the stable boy who'd overheard Alcott's clerk talking. 3 days' notice. She used all 3 of them. By the evening before the meeting, she had spoken to Elena Iriarte, Douglas Pierce, the 2 other ranchers who'd taken the hay arrangement, Dora Mackle, and a man named Sutherland who ran the territory's small newspaper out of a building that was slightly too narrow for the printing press it contained. Sutherland had been interested in the banknote situation since Elena had mentioned it to him, and he was the kind of man, dry, observant, committed to the principle that people in power should be documented, who appreciated being given accurate information in advance of a story becoming public. Gideon found her at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock the night before the meeting, going through the papers she'd organized. "You should sleep," he said, which was what she usually said to him. "I will." She didn't look up. "Sit down." He sat. "What are you working through?" "The order of it, what needs to be said and who should say it and what order creates the best outcome." She looked up. "You should know that I'm planning to speak." I assumed. "Some of what I say is going to be direct." "I know what direct means when you use it," he said, which was one of the more perceptive things he'd said to her, which was saying something. Alcott has been framing this as a morality issue because morality is harder to argue with than finance, she said. "I want to reframe it as a finance issue, because finance can be documented." She spread one of the papers on the table. "He called your note because you wouldn't sell the eastern pasture, which he wants for the consolidation of a land holding that has nothing to do with the bank's legitimate interests. The same pattern has happened twice before in this territory in the past 4 years. I found both cases in the territorial records that Fenn sent. If Sutherland has that information going into that meeting, the story changes." Gideon looked at the paper. "You've been building toward this for a long time." "Since the moment I decided I wasn't taking the return ticket," she said, which was about 4 minutes after he walked away from me on the platform. He was quiet for a moment. "What do you need me to do tomorrow?" "Be present, be calm. Let me speak when I need to speak, and speak yourself when it's your situation to address." She paused. "And don't let them make it about me specifically. If they make it about my character or my history, that's when the room gets divided and we lose half the people we need. If they say something about you." "Let me handle it," she said. "I know how to handle it." He looked at her with the gray eyes that had stopped being unreadable to her somewhere around the 4th week of November. "I know you do," he said. "That's not what I was going to say." She waited. "I was going to say, if they say something about you, I want you to know that what they say and what I know to be true are different things, and nothing they say in that room changes what I know." She looked at him for a moment. "I know that," she said. "Good." He stood. "Get some sleep." The meeting was held in the schoolhouse, which seated perhaps 60 people and had, by the time Clara and Gideon arrived, closer to 70 in it, with another dozen standing around the edges. She had not expected that many, and from the slight tension that crossed Gideon's face when he saw the crowd, neither had he. Warren Alcott was at the front of the room with 2 other men from what passed for Red Hollow's establishment. A man named Carver, who owned the largest parcel of land on the south side of town, and whose interests frequently aligned with Alcott's, and the town's part-time magistrate, a man named Olson, who was technically neutral, and whose neutrality was, in Clara's assessment, the most optimistic thing she was bringing into this room. The crowd was mixed. She could read it in 30 seconds. People who were here because Alcott had influence over them, and they wanted him to see them here. People who were here because something was happening and they didn't want to miss it. People who were here because they had a stake in the outcome one way or another. And a smaller group, Pierce and his foreman, the Iriartes, 2 other ranchers she recognized from the hay arrangement, Dora Mackle in the back, with her arms crossed, and the expression of someone who has decided which side she's on and is here to make that visible, who were here for a specific reason. Sutherland was in this corner with a notebook. Alcott called the meeting to order with the practiced ease of a man who was accustomed to running rooms. He was good at it. She'd grant him that. He had a quality of authority that didn't need to be asserted loudly, the kind that had been built up over years of being the person in a community that people needed things from. When he spoke, people listened, and he knew it and used it the way he used everything, strategically, without waste. He laid out the situation in the framing she'd expected. Community standards, the question of a woman of uncertain character living on a widower's ranch, the implications for the moral standing of Red Hollow's citizenry. He was careful not to be explicitly cruel. He was too intelligent for explicit cruelty, which was what made him more dangerous than a man who simply shouted. She waited. 3 other men spoke in support of his position. 2 of them said essentially the same thing Alcott had said in different words. The third, a rancher named Holt, who she didn't know well, said something more specific about the arrangement being improper and the marriage being a convenient correction of something that should not have been allowed to develop. Gideon moved beside her and she put her hand briefly on his arm, not to restrain him but to indicate she had it. She stood up. The room shifted in the way rooms do when someone unexpected asserts the right to speak. Alcott's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "I'd like to address something Mr. Holt said," she said. Her voice was level and carried without effort because she'd learned in a life of having to make herself heard that volume was less useful than clarity. He described the marriage as a convenient correction. "I want to make sure everyone in this room understands what it's a correction of because I don't think Mr. Holt and I have the same thing in mind." The room was quiet. "I came to Red Hollow in October to marry Warren Alcott," she said. She heard the intake of breath that rippled through the people in the room who hadn't known that. "He had written me letters for 7 months. He had represented himself as a man who wanted a partner, and he had implied, though never stated directly, I'll give him that my history and background were of no consequence to him." She turned slightly so she could see more of the room. "When I arrived, he looked at my dress and my boots, and he told me, in front of approximately 30 witnesses, that I was not acceptable. He used the word something. Ushikishki. Mbopats. Silence. I did not leave," she said, "because I had come here with the intention of building something, and the fact that the specific plan had failed didn't change the intention. Mr. Hale offered me honest work. I took it. I cooked. I managed supplies. I learned to ride. I handled the ranch through a 5-day blizzard, and I negotiated the arrangements that kept 3 of your ranches." She looked at Pierce, who held her gaze, alive through the worst of the winter by ensuring their cattle were fed when their own hay was short. She paused. "That is what actually happened on that ranch. Now, Mr. Alcott would like you to apply a different interpretation to it, and I'd ask you to consider why." Alcott's expression had gone from controlled to something cooler. "Miss Whitmore, Mrs. Hale," she said. A sound from the room. Not laughter. More like the collective exhale of people who hadn't expected that and were recalibrating. "Mrs. Hale," Alcott said, with the studied patience of a man who will not give her the satisfaction of seeing that it costs him. "Your personal account of the situation is not the issue under discussion. The issue is, The issue, said Sutherland from the corner, and people turned, surprised, because he hadn't spoken yet, is also whether the banknote called against the Hale property is a legitimate debt collection or an attempt to acquire land through financial pressure. He had his notebook open. "I have documentation suggesting Mr. Alcott has used the same approach twice previously in this territory. I'll be writing about it regardless of how this meeting concludes. I thought people should know that going in." The room shifted again. She could feel it. The weight of it redistributing, people reassessing where they were standing and what they were standing next to. Alcott looked at Sutherland with the expression of a man who has just seen a variable he didn't account for. "That's a serious allegation." "It's a documented one," Sutherland said. "I'd be happy to discuss it with you privately. Or in print. Your preference." Olson, the magistrate, who had been sitting with the careful neutrality of a man trying to be in the middle of something that was rapidly having no middle, cleared his throat. "I think it would be appropriate to table the specific question of the note for a separate proceeding," he said. "And regarding the social question, It seems to me that the parties concerned are now married, which addresses the concern as it was stated. The concern was about character, Carver said. Marriage doesn't... Whose character? Dora Mackle said from the back of the room. She hadn't moved from where she was standing, still with her arms crossed. Because I've known Warren Alcott for 11 years, and I can tell you things about character that this room might find educational. Alcott turned. I'm not going to, Dora said, because I'm not that kind of person, but I'm also not going to sit here and watch a woman who kept 3 ranches' cattle alive this winter get talked about like she's a problem to be solved. She looked at the room. I think most of you know the difference between what's actually wrong and what's inconvenient. I think most of you know which one this is. The room was quiet. It was the specific quiet of a space in which something has been said that people needed to be said, and that nobody is going to directly contradict, because contradicting it means saying out loud that they prefer inconvenience to principle, and most people are not quite willing to say that out loud in front of 60 of their neighbors. Alcott tried twice more to reframe the discussion, and both times the room gave him less than he was looking for. By the end of the meeting, nothing had been formally resolved. That wasn't how these things worked. But the shape of the community had visibly changed, hairline fractures running through the consensus Alcott had relied on for years. On the way out of the schoolhouse, Douglas Pierce stopped beside Gideon and said, quietly enough that only the 3 of them heard it, "Tell Fenn to write up whatever he needs. I'll sign it." Gideon looked at him. "I don't like banks that behave like that," Pierce said simply, and walked past. Outside in the cold January night, they walked to where the wagon was tied without speaking. Tomas was waiting with the horses, having stayed outside because nobody had thought to tell him he was allowed in, and he was 17 and hadn't wanted to presume. Clara told him he could have come in. He said he heard most of it through the wall anyway. Gideon untied the horses and handed her up into the wagon and then climbed up himself, and they drove the 6 miles north toward the ranch in the dark. Halfway there, he said, without preamble, "You were right about the reframing." "It wasn't certain," she said. "No, but it worked." Sutherland was the turning point, and Dora. "You gave them the information to make those moments possible." She didn't answer that. The road was dark, and the sky was very clear, and the horses moved steadily through the cold, their breath rising and disappearing. Beside her, Gideon was solid and warm in the particular way of a large man in a cold night, and she was aware of him the way she'd been aware of the hawk on the fence post back in October. Something real and present in the landscape, alive in a way that mattered. "He's not done," she said after a while. "No," Gideon agreed. "He's not. The note is still there. We still need Fenn and the cooperative to come through." "I know." She looked out at the dark land moving past them. The ridgelines were visible against the sky, black on dark blue, and the grass in the flat was silver where the moonlight caught it. 6 miles north of Red Hollow, Wyoming Territory, in January of 1884, heading home to a ranch that was still in legal jeopardy and a situation that was not resolved and a life that was not anywhere close to certain. She had been here before, in one version or another. The uncertainty was not new. What was new was the sense, sitting beside Gideon Hale on the wagon seat in the dark, heading back to the house they were going to have to continue fighting for, that the uncertainty was something they were facing together, which was a different kind of math than facing it alone. She reached over and took hold of the edge of his coat, not his hand, not anything dramatic, just a point of contact in the dark. And he didn't say anything about it, just let it be there the way he let most true things be, without requiring them to be explained. The ranch lights came into view at the end of the road. They drove toward them. Aldous Fenn arrived in Red Hollow on the 3rd Tuesday of January, which was colder than any Tuesday had a right to be, and he was not what Clara had pictured from his letters. She had pictured someone older, probably, and more formally assembled. What stepped off the stage from Cheyenne was a man of about 45 with a worn leather satchel that was nearly as battered as her old suitcase had been, a coat that had seen better decades, and the alert, slightly amused eyes of someone who had spent years watching powerful men behave badly and had made his peace with finding it professionally interesting. He shook Clara's hand first, which she noticed, and Gideon's second, and said, "You've created a more complicated situation than your letters suggested," which I mean as a compliment, before he'd been in the wagon for 30 seconds. "Before, the meeting last week," Gideon said. Sutherland sent me the piece he's writing. It's good. It's also going to make Alcott defensive, which cuts both ways. Fenn opened the satchel on his knees and extracted a folder that was held together with a piece of string. I want to see the original note documents tonight and talk through the timeline before I meet anyone from the bank. Is that possible? Kitchen table, Claire said. An hour after supper. Perfect, Fenn said, and looked out at the land passing by with the expression of a man who had ridden through enough of it to find it neither romantic nor threatening, but simply present. Good country out here. It has opinions, Claire said. He glanced at her. Most good country does. They worked at the kitchen table until past midnight, the three of them, with Fenn going through documents with the focused patience of a man who genuinely liked paper and what it contained. He asked questions that were specific and sequential and didn't repeat himself, which Clara appreciated. Gideon answered with the same factual directness he brought to most things, and she filled in the parts she'd assembled from the territorial records and the research she'd done in the weeks since October. The pattern of Alcott's behavior, the two previous cases, the relationship between the note and the Eastern pasture dispute. At one point, Fenn looked up from the papers and said, "How did you find the Carbon County case?" "Territorial court records in Cheyenne," she said. "Tomas's cousin let me use her address for correspondence with the clerk's office." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "You have a systematic mind, Mrs. Hale." "I had a lot of evenings with nothing else to do and a problem I needed to solve," she said. "That's when the best research happens." He went back to the documents. "Here's what we have. The original note terms give Alcott latitude to call early under two conditions: demonstrated financial deterioration of the property or material breach of the loan agreement. You were late twice in year one, recovered fully, documented. That's not material breach. The financial deterioration argument is weak given that the ranch's position has improved in the last quarter, which I can demonstrate through the hay arrangement contracts if they're in writing." "They're in writing," Clara said. She'd made sure of that. Fenn nodded. "Then his legal grounds for calling the note early are thin, not absent. He has a creative lawyer somewhere who found something, but thin. What's less thin is the timing, the pattern, and the established history with the Eastern pasture." He set the papers down. "I want to make two arguments. The first is that the call is not legally supportable under the terms as written. The second is that even if it were technically supportable, the court should look at what's driving it, because a bank that uses its lending position as a tool for property acquisition is not a bank operating in good faith." "The second argument is harder to win," Gideon said. "The second argument is harder to win in court," Fenn said. "It's considerably easier to win in public, which is where I think this actually gets decided. Courts in territories like this are not immune to the climate they exist in." He looked between them. "That meeting last week, the fracture you created in the community's consensus around Alcott, that matters. Not as evidence, as context." "Sutherland's piece," Clara said. "Sutherland's piece, Pierce's willingness to sign an affidavit, the Iriarte Cooperative's backing of the legal costs. These things tell a story about how this territory sees the situation, and judges who live in territories are not blind to those stories." He folded his hands on the table. "I'm not promising anything. I want to be clear about that." "You were clear about it in your letter," Clara said. "We're not asking for promises. We're asking for the best case you can make." He nodded. "Then I think we have one." Alcott's response to Fenn's arrival was to retain his own lawyer from Cheyenne, a man named Gross, who had a reputation for procedural thoroughness and who immediately filed a series of motions that pushed the formal hearing back by 3 weeks. Fenn received each filing with the equanimity of someone who had seen this maneuver before and had planned for it, and during those 3 weeks he stayed in Red Hollow at Mrs. Finch's boarding house, which Clara found quietly satisfying, and did the work of preparing the case with the methodical patience that was apparently his defining professional quality. The 3 weeks were not idle at the ranch. February was hard, in the way February on the frontier was always hard, not dramatically, not with the single catastrophic storm of December, but with the accumulated weight of cold that had been present for months and showed no inclination to lift. The cattle needed daily management. The South Gully herd, including the small black one with the notched ear who had been the sick one, had recovered well enough. The notched ear cow was not going to be anybody's strongest animal, but she was alive and producing, which was more than Clara had expected when she'd first crouched in the snow and felt the heat radiating off her in December. There were 3 neighboring ranches now sending men over for the labor exchanges, and 2 more who had made informal contact suggesting they might participate in spring. Tomas had taken on more responsibility over the winter in the way young people do when they are given the opportunity. He was not the same 17-year-old who'd come back from Cheyenne to find Clara had single-handedly managed a storm, and he knew it, and handled it by working harder rather than by talking about it, which made him excellent company. Gideon's ankle had healed mostly. He still favored it on cold mornings in a way he didn't acknowledge, but the limp was gone by midday when the joint had warmed up, and he'd been back to full work capacity since January. He and Clara had settled into the rhythms of people who have figured out how to share a space and a life without requiring constant negotiation of it. Who started the fire? Who checked the horses first? Who handled the supply calculations and who handled the equipment repairs and the 100 small decisions that a working ranch generated daily? It wasn't a perfect distribution. Some days she was carrying more than her share, and some days he was. And occasionally they disagreed with the friction of 2 people who had strong views about the right way to do things, and had come to those views through different experiences. The worst argument they had in February was about the northern fence line, which she thought needed replacement before spring, and he thought could be repaired adequately. She was right, as it turned out. 3 sections gave way in the first week of March, but she let him come to that conclusion himself rather than saying so, because she had learned something about the specific kind of pride that makes a competent person resistant to being told they were wrong by someone they respect. And the lesson was that it was sometimes more efficient to wait than to push. She thought about that a fair amount that winter. About what she'd come here expecting and what she'd found instead, and whether the distance between those 2 things was a loss or something else. She'd come looking for security, the kind that comes from a specific arrangement, a name attached to a house, a defined role. What she had now was less defined and more real, and she wasn't sure she could have predicted that the second kind was going to be what she actually wanted. The wanting had happened gradually, the way the frontier revealed itself gradually. Not all at once, but piece by piece, the distances opening up as you move through them. She thought about her mother's cookbook on the washstand. Still there, still with the handwriting in the margins. She'd started adding her own notes in the blank spaces, different ink, different hand, her mother's looping cursive, and her own smaller, more angular writing. 2 sets of knowledge in the same book. She didn't examine that too closely. Some things were better understood at a slight distance. The hearing was held on a Friday in late February in the county courthouse in Red Hollow, which was a room that served 4 other functions on different days of the week and had the slightly improvised quality of spaces that are asked to be more formal than their construction intended. Fenn had told them to come early. They came early. Pierce was already there, which she hadn't expected. He'd sent word that he'd signed the affidavit and delivered it to Fenn, but she hadn't known he'd come in person. His foreman was with him. The Iriartes were there, Elena in the coat she wore for town, and Marco with the careful expression of a man who has made a business decision and is prepared to stand by it. Dora Mackle was in the back again, same posture, same expression. Sutherland's piece had run in the territorial paper the previous week. It had been, as Fenn said, good, factual, documented, and written in the plain style that Sutherland favored, which was more damaging to Alcott than any dramatic language would have been because it didn't give him anything to dismiss as exaggeration. It had been picked up by a paper in Cheyenne, which Fenn had mentioned with the mild satisfaction of someone who had expected this and was pleased to be right. Gross, Alcott's lawyer, was thorough. She had to give him that. He had prepared a detailed case built on the technical language of the note agreement and on the argument that the early call was within the bank's rights under the terms as written, and he made it well, in the measured cadence of a lawyer who knows how to use time as a tool. Fenn's counter was structured in the 2-part form he'd outlined at the kitchen table in January. The first part was technical and document-based, built on the receipts and the hay contracts and the financial records that demonstrated the ranch's position had improved rather than deteriorated. It was the drier of the 2 arguments, and he delivered it without flourish, because it didn't need flourish. It needed to be clear, and it was. The second part was different. Fenn stood with the folder in one hand and looked at the presiding magistrate. A circuit judge named Calloway from outside the territory, which Clara had noticed and appreciated, because a local magistrate in this room would have complicated things in ways she didn't want to calculate. And he said, I want to draw the court's attention to a pattern, because individual actions that appear defensible in isolation have a different character when examined as a sequence. He laid it out. The Eastern pasture dispute, 3 years old. The incremental pressures on Alcott's suppliers and contractors who did business with the Hale Ranch. The timing of the note call relative to the arrival of a specific individual, her, he didn't say her name, just a specific individual, whose presence Alcott found objectionable for reasons that were personal rather than financial. The 2 previous cases in Carbon County and Fremont County, documented, in which the same pattern had produced the same result, a note called under questionable conditions, a property acquired at distress pricing by a buyer connected to the calling bank within 8 months of the call. The room was very quiet. Gross objected, twice. The judge noted the objections and sustained neither of them, which was not nothing. Fenn finished. The judge asked several questions that were directed at the technical points, but that, in Clara's reading of them, were also shaped by what he'd heard in the second argument. He asked Gideon 2 questions directly. About the late payments in year 1, which Gideon answered with the receipts in hand, and about the current state of the property's productivity, which Gideon answered with the same factual directness he brought to everything. Alcott, sitting at the other table with Gross, was composed. She'd expected that. He was not a man who gave you the satisfaction of seeing him sweat, but she had been watching his hands under the table, and his right hand had closed around the edge of his chair at some point during Fenn's second argument and had not let go. The judge did not rule from the bench. He said he would issue a written decision within 14 days, thanked both parties, and adjourned. Outside the courthouse, in the cold February air, Fenn stood beside her and Gideon and said, the second question he asked Gideon about current productivity, that was a good sign. You think he's going to fine for us, Gideon said. I think he found the pattern argument interesting in a way that didn't feel adversarial to it, Fenn said. But I've been wrong before, and I'll say that clearly so we're all in the same place. We know, Clara said. Thank you. He shook hands with both of them and went to collect his satchel from the courthouse step where he'd left it, and Douglas Pierce came up and stood beside Gideon and didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there in the solidarity of a man who had decided which way he was facing and had no plans to change it. Good argument, Pierce said finally. Good affidavit, Gideon said. Pierce nodded once. Spring, when you're ready to talk about that fence line on the east boundary, the shared section, I've been thinking we should do it together. I'd like that, Gideon said. Pierce walked off to his horse. Gideon looked at Clara. The fence line, he said. I know, she said. It's a good sign. It's a fence line. It's a fence line that means he's planning to still be your neighbor in spring in a way that involves coordination, she said. Pay attention to what people do with the future. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd come to understand meant he was recording something. Come on, he said. It's cold. The judge's written decision arrived 12 days later, not 14. Fenn had it sent directly to him at Mrs. Finch's, and he came out to the ranch himself rather than sending word, which told Clara something before he'd even gotten off his horse. He came in and sat at the kitchen table and took the document from the satchel and read the relevant section aloud, in the careful, measured way of a man who has learned not to summarize legal decisions because the summary is always less precise than the text. The decision found that the early call was not supportable under the terms of the note as written, given the demonstrated financial trajectory of the property. It ordered the note returned to its original terms. It did not address the second argument directly, but it contained a sentence in the preamble about the court's obligation to consider whether financial instruments were being used for purposes consistent with their stated function, which Fenn said was the judge's way of acknowledging what he'd heard without ruling on something he'd have to defend to a higher court. When Fenn finished reading, the kitchen was quiet. Gideon was looking at the table. Clara was looking at Gideon. He was not a man who performed emotions. She'd known that from the second week, but she'd also learned to read the small things, the particular set of his jaw, the way his hands were resting open on the table, the slight change in the quality of his stillness that meant something was moving through him that he wasn't going to say out loud. She put her hand over one of his. He turned it over and held it. The note terms revert to original, Fenn said, giving them a moment. You'll need to be current on the schedule going forward. I'd suggest getting the spring cattle sale documented carefully in case this comes up again. He paused. He may try again. People like Alcott usually do. Then we'll deal with it when he does, Clara said. Fenn looked at her. Yes, he said. I think you will. Spring came slowly, the way it did on the frontier. Not a clean arrival, but a gradual loosening, snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, then the flats, the mud arriving before the grass arriving before anything could be called warm. The cattle that had come through winter were in reasonable shape, better than Clara had let herself hope during the worst of February, and the spring sale went well enough that by early April they had cleared the back balance on the note and had a margin left over that was small but real. She stood at the edge of the eastern pasture on a morning in April, the one Alcott had wanted, and looked at the grass coming up through the last of the frost damage and thought about how a piece of ground could mean such different things to different people. To Alcott, it had been a calculation, a parcel to be added to a holding, a transaction. To Gideon, it was where his cattle summered, where he'd built the fence line with his own hands 12 years ago, where he could see the ridgeline that told him what weather was coming from the west. She'd only been here 6 months, and she already understood it as the second kind of place. She didn't know exactly when that had happened. Somewhere between the blizzard and the courthouse, probably. The outbuilding they had lost part of the roof on was rebuilt by May. Tomas and 2 men from the Pierce Ranch and 1 from the Iriarte property all came on a Saturday, and they put it right in a day, the way these things worked when they worked, everyone who owed a favor or was building one showing up with tools. Clara made enough food to feed all of them twice over, and she did it without being asked because it needed doing, and that was the only reason she needed. Gideon found her in the kitchen that evening after everyone had gone, the dishes done and the remaining food put away, and she was standing at the east window watching the last of the daylight go out over the rebuilt outbuilding. And he said, "Pierce asked about you today." "What did he ask?" "Whether you'd be willing to talk to his wife about what you did with the hay arrangement last fall. She manages the supply side of their operation." He came to stand beside her at the window. "I think he wants to try something similar with another rancher to the north of them." She looked at the outbuilding. Thought about October, when she'd looked at this window and cataloged it as an asset. Morning light, east-facing, she'd be able to see what she was doing. She'd been right about that. She'd been right about some things and wrong about others, and the ratio had been good enough to get them here, which was all any ratio needed to be. "Tell him yes," she said. Gideon nodded. He didn't move from the window, and neither did she, and they stood there together in the kitchen they'd both learned to live in, watching the light finish its business with the day. "I've been thinking," he said after a while. "About what?" "About what Fenn said, that Alcott might try again." He was quiet for a moment. "I spent 3 years being defensive about this ranch, trying to hold what I had, waiting for the next thing he was going to do." He looked at the window, not at her. "You came here and you built forward instead. The hay arrangement, the cooperative connection, Pierce, the Iriartes. You built things that made the ranch harder to attack because it was woven into more people's interests." She waited. When he had something to say, he said it on his own schedule, and interrupting it didn't help. "I want to keep doing that," he said, "not just to protect against him, because it's right. Because the way a ranch survives out here is by being part of something bigger than itself." He turned to look at her. "I didn't know that before you came. I thought survival was about holding on." She considered that. "Sometimes it is." "Sometimes," he agreed, "but not always." She turned from the window and sat at the kitchen table, and after a moment he sat across from her, the same positions they'd been in on the night they'd decided to fight the note, and the night they'd mapped the storm, and dozens of other nights when the work of the day had ended and the work of thinking had begun. "He's going to be fine, you know," she said. "Alcott. Men like that always land on something. He'll turn to the next property, the next note, the next person who can't fight back the way we did." "I know." "That bothers me more than what he did to us," she said. "What he did to us we could answer. What he does to people who can't answer it." "I know," Gideon said again. "That's why Fenn is writing up the full case history for the Territorial Bar Association, the 2 previous cases and ours. So it's on record somewhere that someone looked at the pattern. She hadn't known that. When did you talk to Fen about that? Last week, I wrote to him. A pause. You're not the only one who writes letters. She looked at him. He was watching her with the gray eyes, and there was something in them that was almost humor. The dry, interior kind he kept mostly to himself, but which she'd gotten better at seeing over the winter. You've been taking notes, she said. I've been paying attention, he said. You showed me it was worth doing. She thought about the cookbook, 2 sets of handwriting, 2 people's accumulated knowledge in the same binding, the margins getting fuller as the years. And there would be years, she understood that now with a clarity she hadn't had in October, went on. Good, she said. Keep paying attention. There's a thing that happens to people who survive something hard together, and it isn't what the stories usually say it is. It isn't that they become invincible, or that the hard thing recedes into something picturesque and manageable in memory. What actually happens is quieter and more durable than that. The hard thing stays hard in memory. But it also becomes evidence, proof of a specific kind that is more valuable than the theoretical kind, the proof that you can be in the worst of it and still be standing when it lifts. Clara Hale. She had been Clara Whitmore for 26 years and was now Clara Hale, and the second name fit in a way the first hadn't, not because a name is a self, but because this one had been chosen rather than inherited. Understood this by the time the first full year was over. She was not the woman who had gotten off that train in October with a broken suitcase and a plan that had already failed. She was also not entirely different from her. The same stubbornness, the same habit of standing up when she could have stayed down, the same careful accounting of what was real versus what she'd hoped. What had changed was what surrounded those qualities. She had built something to put them inside of, and the something was solid. The ranch grew, not quickly and not without setback. There was a bad summer 2 years later when the creek ran dry and they lost 24 head of cattle to the drought, and a spring 3 years after that when a late freeze caught the calves, and they both worked 4 days straight with almost no sleep trying to save what they could. These things happened. They kept happening because that is the nature of land and weather and the gap between what you plan and what arrives. The difference was that they were not starting from nothing each time. They had built enough that the bad years took from a surplus rather than from nothing, which is the only way to survive on the frontier long term, and which Clara understood as a principle that applied to more than ranching. Tomas stayed. That surprised her, and then didn't, because he had built as much into this place as anyone. He took on the management of the northern pasture in the 2nd year, and by the 3rd was effectively running the day-to-day cattle operation with a competence that made Gideon, who was not a man to say things out loud that he felt, say to Clara one evening, "He's going to be better at this than I am by the time he's 30. In the tone of someone who is proud of a thing and sad about a different aspect of the same thing. And she'd said, "That's exactly what you were hoping for when you kept him on." And he'd said, "Yes," and they'd left it there. The Iriarte Cooperative grew into something more formal. Clara was part of 3 conversations that shaped its charter in the 2nd year. And Elena Iriarte, who had the direct and specific intelligence of someone who understood systems at a level most people didn't bother with, told her once that the hay arrangement Clara had put together in the first winter had been the thing that convinced the cooperative's board that the smaller frontier operations could work together rather than purely competing with each other. "You made the first move," Elena said. Everyone was waiting for someone to make the first move. Clara didn't say anything about that because she didn't know what to say about it. That wouldn't sound like either false modesty or something she hadn't earned. She stored it in the category of things that were true and mattered, and that she didn't need to make a speech about. Warren Alcott did not try again directly. The Territorial Bar Association's record, and Sutherland's continued interest in the story, and the loss of the hearing had combined into a kind of documented history that made direct action against the Hale Ranch too visible to be worth it. He shifted his attention north toward larger land holdings where the leverage was different, and the smaller ranchers of Red Hollow's territory found, in the years after the hearing, that the cooperative made them collectively harder to pick off than they'd been individually. She heard through Elena that Alcott had said something at a dinner in Cheyenne about the situation, about the woman from the train platform, the one he'd sent away, and how she'd turned out to be more than he'd assessed. It wasn't an apology. It was the kind of acknowledgement that men like him give when the evidence has become impossible to argue with, the kind that costs them nothing because they frame it as insight rather than error. She heard it and felt nothing in particular, which was its own kind of information. There had been a time when she'd wanted him to understand what he'd done. That time had passed. What he thought about her now was as relevant to her life as the weather in a city she'd never visited. The children came in the 2nd and 4th years, a girl they named Ruth after Gideon's mother, and a boy they named James for no reason either of them could explain, except that when they looked at him, the name was simply there. Ruth was, from the first week, a child with opinions and the determination to express them, which Gideon took as evidence of character and which Clara took as evidence that she was going to have her hands full. James was quieter and watched everything with the serious attention of a person cataloging the world for later use. Both of them grew up knowing that the work was real and mattered, and that a ranch did not run on sentiment but on daily showing up, because that was the only education their parents knew how to give, because it was the only education that had actually worked. On a morning in October, it was always October when the significant things happened, she'd noticed that. 6 years after she'd walked down from the train platform in Red Hollow, Clara stood at the east window of the kitchen with the cookbook open on the washstand beside her and looked at the margins, which were full now, 2 sets of handwriting overlapping in the way that accumulation works, one generation's knowledge and then the next. And she thought about the woman who had made the first set of notes and what she would think of where the book had ended up. Her mother had been a practical woman. She would not have wasted time on sentiment about it. She would have looked at the kitchen, the healthy children, the ranch visible through the window in October light, and she would have said something about the soup being too thin or the window needing recaulking, which would have been her way of saying she approved, because practical women express approval through the identification of what still needs doing. Clara added a note in the margin of a page she'd referenced 3 times this month, and closed the book, and went to start the day. Gideon was at the table when she came through, coffee already made, Ruth sitting across from him eating with the focused intensity of a 6-year-old who has views about breakfast, and James still asleep in the way that 4-year-olds are, completely without apology. "The northern fence," Gideon said. "I know. Tomas mentioned it yesterday. I'll go out after breakfast." "Take Ruth," she said. "She needs something to do and she's been underfoot since Monday." Ruth looked up from her breakfast with an expression of pure calculation, assessing whether being taken to the northern fence was better or worse than whatever she'd been planning. She apparently decided better because she went back to eating with renewed purpose. Gideon looked at Clara with the look she knew, the one that was not quite a smile and not quite not a smile, the one that had taken her 2 months to see and another 2 months to understand, and that she now read as easily as a weather. "Sit down," he said. "Have coffee first." She sat. He poured. Outside the window, the October light was doing what it always did, arriving honest and clear, without the softening that came later in the year, showing everything as it actually was. The rebuilt outbuilding. The barn in better repair than it had been in October 6 years ago. The corral where Dix was standing with the particular stillness of an old horse who has earned the right to stand still. The pasture beyond, the grass going gold, the ridgeline in the distance that told you what was coming from the west. There were people who came to the frontier and were broken by it, and people who were bent by it and recovered, and people who looked at what it was asking of them and decided to answer. Clara Hale had not come here to be broken or to be made into something picturesque or to prove a point to a man in a well-trimmed suit. She had come because she had run out of other options, and she had stayed because she had built something worth staying for. And those 2 facts together were the honest version of the story. It was not a simple story, and it did not have the clean shape of the kind that gets told around dinner tables as an illustration of what's possible. It was messier than that. It had blizzards and bad ankles and collapsed roofs and arguments about fence lines and a bank hearing in a room that smelled of other people's business, and also children eating breakfast and a horse going still in a corral and a cookbook with 2 sets of handwriting and a man across a kitchen table who had learned to say what he meant even when it took him 3 attempts to get there. She drank her coffee. She thought about something she'd worked out slowly over the 6 years, the way you work out things that are true rather than things you want to be true. That belonging is not given. It is not in a letter written across 7 months of careful promises, and it is not in a name on a banknote or address that doesn't have any visible repairs or a position in a community that grants you standing before you've done anything to earn it. Belonging is made. It is made the way everything real on the frontier is made, by showing up for it, day after day, in weather you didn't choose and with materials that are never quite what you ordered, until one morning you look around and what you've built is stronger than what you started with, and the place where you're standing is yours. Not because anyone gave it to you, but because you know every fault in the floor and every draft in the window and every personality of every animal in the corral and the name of the specific quality of light that comes through the east window in October and means the day is beginning and there is work to do. The coffee was good. Gideon had gotten better at making it over 6 years, or she'd gotten less particular, or both. "Ready?" he said. She looked at him across the table, at the kitchen around them, which was hers in the way that things you've worked for become yours, at the window with its October light. "Yes," she said, and meant it without qualification, which was the rarest and most valuable kind of meaning there was. She stood up. The day was waiting, the way days did, without sentiment, without patience, with the plain and absolute requirement that you show up for it. She did.